Recently, I answered a question in the really cool r/askhistorians thread on transgender history that they set up for Pride Month, which was really cool of them to do. It was about the Enaree. Do you remember them? The trans feminine priestesses from the Scythian culture who may have used pregnant horse urine as a form of early HRT 2,500 years ago? Yeah, those ones. This was the first topic I covered on this channel other than the intro video, and if you go back and watch it, I know the quality is kind of rough. I'm still kind of trying to figure things out, not quite sure, but I think I've got it figured out at least a little better than I did back then. Anyway, it's probably a good idea to watch that one first, because I don't really want to go back into all the context. That's, we've already got the video up. But this one is going to reference that one quite a bit. So if you haven't watched that one yet, it's probably a good idea to start. I'll put it somewhere up there, a link in case you've missed it. Anyway, this person wanted to know what, if anything, we knew about how the Enaree became the Enaree. Did they have a choice in the matter, or were they chosen to become Enaree? That's a great question. Let's take a look. Before we get into that though, I want to do the old YouTube song and dance thing. I know it's tired at this point. I know everyone does it in every channel and it's kind of boring and it's kind of cliche, but at the same time, it really does make a difference. Would you please take a moment to like, comment, and subscribe? When you do that, it tells the algorithm that people like you like videos like this. So the algorithm will show this video to people like you. So if you think people like you would like this video, then people like you should like this video. And if you really like this channel, there is a link to my Patreon in the description. It really does make a difference in helping this channel become more self-sustaining, and it starts at just $1 a month. But if not, no biggie, that's okay. You don't have to subscribe to my Patreon, but just a little like, comment, subscribe. Is that really too much to ask? I slave all day over a hot keyboard, working for you people, trying to put these videos together. The least you could do is give me a like, a comment, to subscribe. Is that really too much to ask? I mean, come on. All right, enough with the guilt trip. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. What do the primary sources tell us? As a reminder, our primary sources on this one are Herodotus and Pseudo-Hippocrates, both Greeks. If you recall in the original, Ovid was also a source that we used, but he doesn't really tell us much that's useful in this context. So Ovid, you can stay home today. One of the things Pseudo-Hippocrates says is that there seems to be a fear among the Scythians that they may become Enarei themselves. He says, quote, "The inhabitants of the country attribute the cause of their impotence to a god, and venerate and worship such persons, everyone dreading that the like might befall himself." The average Scythian man, it seems, wanted to make sure he did not become an Enarei. He didn't hate the Enarei, in fact he quite revered them, but he didn't want to be like them. And if you're the ancient equivalent to a Scythian cisgender man, that makes perfect sense, doesn't it? He also talks at great length at how common impotence is among the Scythians, and he doesn't really do a very good job of distinguishing between a Scythian man who was impotent and the Enarei, who he also describes as eunuchs. So, were Scythian men afraid of becoming Enarei? Or were they afraid of being impotent? Those are two very different things. Herodotus also tells us that the Enaree's gift of divination was hereditary, and that the Enarei often came from influential families within Scythian society. But then again, Pseudo-Hippocrates tells us they were eunuchs and they were impotent. And it's hard to imagine a situation where a hereditary priesthood are impotent eunuchs and having that priesthood last very long. Another way to interpret this might be to say that there were certain families that had the gift of divination, and the Enarei came from those families, but then obviously not all the people in those families would be Enarei, otherwise those families would end pretty quickly.
It's just basic biological reality. Facts don't care about your feelings, snowflake.
So, we're really no closer to answering our question, are we? One might imagine a situation where, for example, the youngest Scythian man from certain families is chosen to join the ranks of the Enarei. And this is a great honor for him. He's very excited for this, but not only is there no evidence that that's the case, I don't think it makes a whole lot of sense to assume that something like that could even be possible. We may not know for sure the specifics of how the Scythian Enaree became the Enaree, but modern sociology can give us some great insight into how sex and gender roles work. And even though this was from 2,500 years ago, there's no reason to believe that the way we experience gender internally is any different, although the way gender is interpreted and expressed is very much different depending on which society you came from. And there's one case in particular that, tragic and heartbreaking though it might be, I think outlines this pretty clearly. It's worth noting that after this point, this video gets into some pretty nasty stuff. So if you have triggers related to medical trauma, or if you are intersex or related to self-harm, it might be best to sit this one out. I'm not going to blame you. Chapter 2. The Story of David Reimer. David Reimer was one of a set of twin boys born in August 1965 in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Or should I just say MB? You ever notice how you talk to Americans online and they always just use an acronym for whatever state they're from? Hey, where are you from? Wah. I don't know what that acronym is, so I'll just assume you're from Waluigi. Anyway, at about 8 months old, David and his twin brother Brian developed a condition called phimosis. This is a condition where the foreskin doesn't properly retract, which makes urination difficult. The solution offered was to have the boys circumcised. Usually this is done with a scalpel, but the Reimer's surgeon chose an option called electrocautery. This was unusual even for the time, and today the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Manitoba specifically recommends against using this method. David was up first, and the physician botched the procedure. I don't want to go into details about what happened, but suffice it to say, David's penis was damaged beyond its ability to function. The Reimer parents wisely decided not to subject Brian to this procedure, and his phimosis cleared up on its own, which I'm told it usually does. Meanwhile, the Reimers had a dilemma. Their twin boys weren't identical anymore. What were they to do about this? They spoke to a bunch of different specialists, and nobody really had a clear solution for what to do, because this isn't exactly the sort of thing that comes up every day. The Reimers were notably worried about David's potential future happiness, but they were kind of stuck. However, after a few months of despair, the Reimers watched a TV show that gave them a glimmer of hope. At the Johns Hopkins Medical Center in Baltimore, MD, which I'm told doesn't stand for medical doctor but Maryland, the first gender identity clinic in the United States had begun operation. The TV program the Reimers saw focused on an interview between a transgender woman who had recently received bottom surgery at the clinic and describing her results. She was quite happy with them, by the way. The interviewer was one Dr. John Money, who was the clinic's co-founder. Dr. John Money was born in New Zealand, where he began his study of psychology, but eventually he moved to the US to study it further. Eventually he earned a PhD from Harvard. After, he became a professor of pediatrics at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, where he spent the majority of his career. One of Dr. Money's main areas of clinical interest was in gender and sexuality. In particular, he believed that gendered behavior was learned rather than innate. Money argued, for example, that a woman didn't wear dresses and makeup and high heels, etc., because she was a woman, but because she lived in a society that encouraged such behaviors. There's nothing biological about wanting to wear makeup. That's just what happens when you live in a society that frames femininity in that way. These are ideas that we still accept within the study of gender today. Dr. Money also believed that gender was malleable from a very early age. That is, babies are essentially born as blank slates, and a boy raised as a girl or a girl raised as a boy will end up being perfectly happy living within those gender roles. Today we know this to be false. And I mean, I'm sitting here before you, I'm wearing makeup, I'm wearing a skirt, I'm wearing a bra, and I was raised as a boy. Everybody treated me as a boy from the time I was born until I became an adult, except, random chat rooms when I was a teenager, but that's a different story. But at the time, this is what John Money believed. He proceeded on this belief in treating intersex infants, giving them bottom surgeries to bring them more in line with what the perceived gender identity was going to be for these children. Today, this is considered so harmful that the UN actually condemns the practice. After seeing this TV program, the Reimers had a renewed sense of hope that maybe there was something they could do for poor David. So in 1967, they traveled to Baltimore to meet with Dr. Money. He saw the Reimers as a perfect situation to test his theories. After all, these were twin boys, genetically identical, raised by the same parents in more or less the same environment. It doesn't get much better than that. David was the experiment, and Brian was the control. Dr. Money suggested that they give David bottom surgery to construct a vagina and raise him as a girl. Why that? Why not penile reconstruction? At the time, it was fairly rudimentary, and the general consensus was that such a member would be useful for peeing, and that's about it. On the other hand, vaginal construction was much more advanced. So, Money described the process of surgical intervention to change David into a girl, and the Reimers agreed. Several months later, they returned with both boys, and David got his surgery and his new identity. They chose a new name for him. I'm not going to mention it here because I don't think it's appropriate to dead name somebody, but it's not that hard to find if you really want to look it up. As part of Money's process, David was never to be told about his history, and the Reimers were fully committed to treating him like a girl. From an early age, however, the Reimers described how this didn't seem to work. As the twins grew up, David rejected many of the aspects of femininity that were forced upon him. Brian Reimer describes what the process of growing up with David was like in an interview with Rolling Stone. Quote, "When I say there was nothing feminine about David, I mean there was nothing feminine. She walked like a guy, she talked about guy things, didn't give a crap about cleaning house, getting married, wearing makeup. We both wanted to play with guys, build forts, and have snowball fights and play army." David, on the other hand, describes his earliest feelings of incongruence with femininity. Quote, "You know generally what a girl is like, and you know generally what a guy is like, and everybody is telling you that you're a girl, but you say to yourself, I don't feel like a girl. You think girls are supposed to be delicate and like girl things, tea parties, things like that, but I like to do guy stuff. It doesn't match, so you figure, well, there's something wrong here. If I'm supposed to be like this girl over here, but I'm acting like this guy, I guess I gotta be an it." David in particular was bullied relentlessly when the twins started school, a theme that would continue throughout his adolescence. The twins continued to see Dr. Money about once a year after that. He said it was for psychiatric evaluations, but it was just as much to continue his research and make notes on his experiment. And here's where things get really, really dark. Money would ask probing questions about the twins' sexuality, whether they felt physical or sexual attraction, whether they ever daydreamed about having sex. He would show them naked pictures of young boys and young girls, as well as adults having heterosexual sex. This way, they could understand the difference between their organs and how to make them work. He also had the twins remove each other's clothes and touch each other, as well as imitate sexual acts with each other, all the while he and his colleagues watched. On at least one occasion, he photographed them doing this. According to David, if he or his brother resisted these instructions, they were met with verbal abuse from Dr. Money. David describes these sessions further, quote, "I remember getting yelled at by Money because I was defiant. He just told me to take my clothes off, and I just did not do it. I just stood there, and he screamed, 'Now!' louder than that. I thought he was going to give me a whooping. So I just took my clothes off and stood there, shaking." This was unsurprisingly extremely traumatizing for both boys, and they started resisting going to these sessions from a very young age. At one point, David even threatened suicide if his parents sent him back. At the beginning of high school, David started to feel extreme social anxiety as a result of the feminine role being foisted upon him. His teachers noticed this and referred him to a psychiatrist, Dr. Keith Sigmundson. David told Dr. Sigmundson that he suspected something had been done to his genitals from a very young age. This was exacerbated by the fact that he was supposed to go for a follow-up surgery to construct a vaginal canal, which he resisted as much as he could. He also resisted taking estrogen supplements, but eventually he relented on that one. Around the middle of his teenage years, David simply stopped living as a girl. He threw away his dresses and only wore men's clothing. This caused even more issues at school, to the point where eventually he just refused to go. Eventually, the Reimers, along with Dr. Sigmundson, realized that this whole thing was clearly not working out, and they decided to tell David about his background. So, at 14 years old, his father took him out for ice cream and explained the entire situation.
Suddenly, it all made sense why I felt the way I did.
David told Rolling Stone.
I wasn't just some sort of weirdo.
Shortly after, David stopped taking estrogen and took testosterone instead. He also had top surgery to have his breasts surgically removed and also had bottom surgery. He changed his name from the girl's name his parents gave him, but instead of choosing his birth name, he went with the name David, since he saw his story as a bit of a David and Goliath sort of situation, having overcome incredible odds to reclaim who he was. After a few months of recovery, he started a new school and a new social life. His brother and his friends immediately accepted him as one of the guys, and his social life began for what may have been the first time in his life. But he particularly had anxiety about dating. He was a handsome young guy, and the ladies started to notice, but his downstairs didn't work the way it ought to have. He could not become erect. He did start seeing a girl for a few months, and after a while, he told her about his situation, and she blabbed to the entire school, which again destroyed David's social life, sending him into another anxiety spiral that culminated in his first suicide attempt. After downing a bottle of antidepressants, his parents found him and had his stomach pumped, saving his life. He tried again a week later, this time having been found by his brother. David once again withdrew socially, spending months at a time all by himself in a cabin in the woods up north. Brian, meanwhile, married and had children, which further exacerbated David's loneliness. His brother had everything he ever wanted, and it seems like he could never have. However, Brian introduced his brother to a friend of theirs, a woman who had 3 kids from 3 different fathers. David was, of course, concerned, but she knew about his condition and she didn't seem to mind. After all, he was a kind man, and she had all the kids she wanted to have, and was really just looking for someone to treat her kindly and be a good father figure to her kids. They hit it off well, and within a year, David asked her to marry him, which she did. He got a job in a factory, bought a house, and together they settled into a nice suburban middle-class lifestyle. In 1994, David was contacted by Dr. Sigmundson again, the psychologist he had seen in high school. Along with his colleague Milton Diamond, the two wanted to check up and see how he was doing. At first, David wanted nothing to do with his past. He just wanted to put it behind him. But then the two told him about Dr. Money's research. You see, during these years of psychological torment, Dr. Money had been reporting David's case as a complete success. Calling it the John/Joan case, he said David was successfully living as a girl and displayed girlish behaviors in contrast to his brother's boyishness, which was of course not true. In particular, to David's horror, Dr. Money was using this as an excuse to perform surgeries on other infants, in particular intersex infants. He wanted to make sure that others were prevented from the nightmare that he had gone through, so he decided to speak out about his experience. In 1997, David and his brother Brian were interviewed by John Colapinto from Rolling Stone, which is where I got the quotes for this video from. A few years later, Colapinto wrote a book about the Reimer's experience, and David also appeared on Oprah. David's courage to come forth and speak about his experiences, no matter how embarrassing or traumatizing that might have been for him, went a long way toward refuting Money's idea that gender was entirely a result of social conditioning rather than an innate part of who we are. Today, we understand that one's sense of gender is largely immutable. Regardless of how much you try to force it, boys can't be girls, and girls can't be boys. After all, David's sense of his own gender was so profound, so powerful, that no matter what anybody tried to do, no matter how much social conditioning was forced upon him, he was never going to be a girl. It just wasn't ever going to happen. No matter how hard you try, no matter how much you try to force it, no matter how many creepy psychologists you employ, you can't force somebody to be a gender other than the one they already feel they are inside. It also supports the idea of not performing medically unnecessary surgeries on intersex infants, which is a position supported by intersex advocacy groups. Money was reportedly personally ashamed of this failure, though he never commented on it publicly. He continued his sexology research and ended up dying in the year 2006 at 84 years old due to Parkinson's disease. What about the Reimers? Brian, who had severe depression and schizophrenia, ended up taking his own life in 2002 after swallowing a bottle of antidepressants. This sent David into an intense spiral of depression. He visited his brother's grave every day, absolutely heartbroken. Shortly after, he lost his job, and then in 2004, his wife asked him for a divorce. 2 days later, he drove to a parking lot of a grocery store and fatally shot himself. He was just 38 years old. Chapter 3. The Legacy of John Money. I know this is a little heavier than most of my videos. This is a lot to grapple with, I know. On one hand, John Money's breadth of research led to a much better understanding of gender and sexuality. Our modern understanding of how gender works wouldn't be the same without his work. He coined terms like gender role and sexual orientation, which of course are in the common lexicon today. He also pioneered research on using anti-androgens on sex offenders to reduce recidivism, which has proven to be a great success and is used in many areas today. On the other hand, he was very clearly a creepy pervert who sexually, psychologically, and verbally abused 2 young boys to the point that they committed suicide. And the Reimer's case is not the only case where he shows a frankly shocking lack of medical ethics. And so, of course, it's probably not much of a surprise to realize that the usual gang of ghouls are jumping on this one to proclaim the sinister origins of gender ideology.
Hi-ho, Jordan B. Peterson here, and this video should reveal once and for all the insidious and pernicious dogma underpinning the so-called trans ideology and its goals of eradicating Western civilization.
Let's say, hypothetically speaking, the trans rights movement, led by the radical left Democrats, was founded by a pedophile.
I guess we gotta talk about the dum-dums.
On the surface, this all seems like a really big deal. What do we do with this? This is part of the complications of the process of research and discovery in the first place. The history of science is full of all sorts of messy stuff like this. This is not unique to gender and sexuality studies. In fact, few fields are without any sort of research that you might consider to be absolutely horrifying as a decent human being. For example, are you interested in rocketry and space exploration? Me too, I love that stuff. Ever since I was a little kid, I was so enamored by the moon in particular. I thought the moon was the coolest thing on Earth, and I was so inspired by it. I was particularly interested in the Apollo missions, which I thought was just unbelievable, even though they happened more than a decade before I was born, but it was still just so intriguing that thing up there were people that had actually been there. You might have noticed in some of my previous videos, it's not here right now. I moved it to a different part of my house, but I have a moon globe because I just love the moon so much. I just think it's so cool. But the Apollo missions would not have been possible without the help of Dr. Wernher von Braun. Wernher von Braun was a member of the Nazi Party in Germany during the Second World War. You can find photos of him wearing an SS uniform, having been photographed with other high-ranking Nazi officials like Heinrich Himmler or Fritz Todt. I'm not going to post them in this video. They're not going to be part of this because I don't want this thing to get demonetized, but it's not hard to find these pictures if you want to go look for them. Von Braun said that he only joined the Nazi Party because he wanted to work on rockets, which, okay, but you also didn't seem to have too much trouble using slave labor to build the rockets that you were building, did you, Dr. Wernher von Braun? After the Second World War, Wernher von Braun was brought to the US, where he worked on the Apollo program along fellow SS officers Kurt Debus and Bernhard Tessmann. And they were far from the only Nazis that were brought over after the Second World War by the US. Operation Paperclip, led by the CIA, brought over hundreds of these guys. Do you think it's a good thing for heroin addicts to be able to fight their addiction? Yeah, me too. I'm a big fan of that. There's a major addiction problem in the city I live in, and I think it would be great if we could get all addicts to not be addicts anymore, to treat them, to help them become productive members of society, to help them live decent lives. I think that's great. I think it's really cool. If you think that too, then hey, we have something in common. But the best way we know to treat heroin addicts is by using a drug called methadone, which is, you guessed it, a Nazi innovation. Do you think we should treat malaria? Again, me too, big fan of that. I think not having malaria is a great idea. I've done it my whole life and I plan to continue not having malaria. I think we should be able to treat people with malaria and save a whole bunch of lives. But the best drug we know of to treat malaria is called chloroquine. And where do you think that one came from? Yeah, same deal. How about our understanding of hypothermia, dehydration, hypoxia, things like that? Do you think people should die of those? No, me neither. I think it's great that we have treatments for those things. But how do you think we found out about those things? Nazi concentration camps. How about polio? Do you think it's good that we don't have much polio anymore? Me too. Big fan of not having polio. And a big reason why we don't have polio around much anymore is because we have a vaccine against polio. And where did that vaccine come from? This one's not the Nazis. This one is from a woman named Henrietta Lacks. She was a black woman living in the US who went to the doctor complaining about vaginal bleeding. They took a look and they found a malignant tumor in her cervix. So they biopsied part of it to send it off to the lab to be analyzed. While they analyzed it, they found some things that were genetically unique about it, and further analysis led to vaccines against polio, as well as a number of other different illnesses. Meanwhile, Henrietta's consent was never sought for this research, and she ended up dying poor in obscurity at 31 years old, leaving behind 5 children. Is that okay? No, absolutely not. And she's far from the only black woman in the US who was taken advantage of by the American medical system. I could go on. There's plenty of nasty stuff in the history of science. This video is depressing enough as it is. We don't need to go any further into this stuff. I think you get the point. Sometimes bad people come to useful conclusions. And sometimes bad people come to useful conclusions through bad methods. It definitely doesn't mean we should throw that research out and just ignore it, but if you're having trouble grappling with this, that just means you have a conscience. In John Money's case, what he did to the Reimer boys was absolutely unconscionable, but it does give us some interesting insight into the nature of gender. David Reimer was treated like a cis girl, raised like a cis girl, had surgery to bring his anatomy in line with a cis girl's anatomy, and he was not a girl. Nothing they did could make that happen. In the nature versus nurture argument, nature wins, at least in this case. Chapter 4. What does this have to do with the Enaree? This video was about the Scythians, right? What does this all have to do with them? The David Reimer story very clearly tells us that gender is an innate part of who we are. The way we express that gender might be different depending on the time period in which we live and the society we grow up in, but there's no real reason to believe that how we experience it internally is any different than it used to be. As a result, I cannot imagine a society where boys are told they have to live as women and have them be happy about it. The Enaree, then, must have been able to volunteer to become Enaree, or at least to resist it if they were chosen to do so. If you're trans, this should be a no-brainer. I mean, we all tried really, really hard to be the gender we were assigned at birth. I know I did. I know you did too. We did our damnedest. It wasn't going to work. But if you're cis, take a moment and consider this. What would you do if an authority figure came to you and said, hey, you gotta live your life on the opposite end of the gender binary? Of course, you'd say, no, I don't want to do it. But imagine a world where you don't really have that choice to resist. How would you react to being forced to live as a gender other than the one that you currently do. Would you be happy with that? Would you be able to live a fulfilling life? And if the answer is no, you just answered my question. And if the answer is yes, you might not be as cis as you think you are.